Morning to you and welcome to this fourth meeting of the Referendum Scotland Bill Committee. Tavish Scott has sent his apologies in for absence and Willie Rennie's attending in his place, but I don't think there are any other apologies. In which case that takes us to item 1, the declaration of interests, and the first item on the agenda is to enable Willie Rennie to declare whether he's got any relevant interests or not. Willie?
No.
Thank you very much. Very grateful to you. Item 2 is about whether or not we should take an item in private, and that will be the issue of whether or not, in principle, we should have an advisor for the committee, rather than the issue of who that actual advisor will be. And I think we'd all agree that should be taken in public at this stage. And if we're agreed with that, we can move on to the next item. Thank you. That takes us then to item 3 on the agenda, some more oral evidence from witnesses. And the first panel, I'm very warm welcome to you this morning, both from the University of Edinburgh. First of all, Mr Galley, who's a lecturer in public law, and Dr Nicola McEwen from the School of Social and Political Science. Now, as I explained to the committee earlier, Professor Walker had to at the last minute pull out. So, Mr Galley, I'm particularly pleased that at such short notice you were able to come and prepare to give evidence to us and submit a paper in such a short space of time. I'm very grateful. I just wonder if you want to make any brief opening remarks before we begin, or do you want to just get straight into issues of questions? Okay, well, thank you. Well, I've got just one fundamental question at the start of the process, because I was interestingly reading through the evidence from the House of Lords, and you may not have seen the evidence or not, but they come to a conclusion after a number of paragraphs of deliberation to finally say that in terms of the Section 30 order, that it cannot be safely said that the arrangement proposed put the matter beyond all legal challenge. Now, that surprised me. And I just wonder, in your view, from the Section 30 order, had they put in the word successful, I could have understood, because somebody might yet raise a legal challenge. But given that they said it cannot safely be said that the arrangement proposed put the matter beyond all legal challenge, I just wonder how you would react to that, and what your view would be of that comment from the House of Lords.
First of all, and probably not for the first time this morning, not for the last time this morning, I'll say I'm not a constitutional lawyer. However, I have the utmost respect for the opinions of colleagues who are, and I'm fairly confident that this does indeed overcome some of the uncertainties around the legal status. That's not to say that I think it was necessarily, but I think it does put the issue beyond legal doubt.
Mr Galley?
Yeah, my reading of what the House of Lords had to say on this is that, well, the structure of their argument is repeatedly such an argument could be made, but it would be extremely unlikely to succeed. And then they move on to the next argument and adopt exactly the same structure. So I think they're accepting the reality that there may be an abstruse argument that could be made. It would be extremely unlikely to succeed, and that it's their duty to point that out. But more than that, I don't think they're saying.
And they also got any questions about the fundamental issues? Annabel?
It's really following in that point, Convener. Professor Galley, given that the prospect, as you've just stated, is remote of a challenge, do you agree that there are ways of mitigating that challenge? Therefore, it's important for this Parliament to ensure that it reflects the Edinburgh Agreement and the subsequent legislative process as closely as possible, and that these elements of transparency and fairness and respect for the outcome of the vote all need to be protected?
I'm not sure I precisely got the question from that.
Well, it's this point that the House of Lords report raises, that technically there could be challenge to this whole procedure. And yet we heard in evidence last week that a court would probably be very unlikely to entertain a challenge if it thought that the Parliament had genuinely tried to reflect as best it could the intentions of the two governments as reflected by the Edinburgh Agreement. And all I'm asking is that if every effort is made to ensure that the pillars of the Edinburgh Agreement are covered, a court would probably be very reluctant to entertain a challenge.
I think that's probably right. That's not the primary basis, though, on which this report, in particular paragraph 25, that's the House of Lords report from the day before yesterday, that's not the primary basis on which they see a challenge, that a challenge could be made. They make it on straightforward Padfield administrative law grounds. So even if there was departure in this Section 30 order from the Edinburgh Agreement, or, well, if there was fidelity between the Section 30 order and the Edinburgh Agreement, those Padfield criteria that would still remain as a basis of challenge.
It would be helpful for committee members, certainly helpful for me, the Hatfield criteria, if you could expand that. And what is that, what's that criteria actually mean because of you?
I'm going to stick quite closely to what the House of Lords, what the Constitution Committee had to say. It's the basic idea that statutory powers may only be used to promote and not frustrate the policy and object of the Act. So the question is, does an order made under the Scotland Act promote or frustrate the objectives of the Scotland Act? And is an independence referendum a promotion of the objects of the Act or a frustration of the objects of the Act? You can see how it could be argued that it would be a frustration of the objects of the Act. That it's not about devolution, it's about a separate substantive matter, namely independence. So that would be the basis of that challenge.
Okay, understand that now. Annabelle, anyone, Annabelle? Anybody else want to follow up that particular line? Okay, can we go into any other areas members want to raise? James?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning and welcome to the committee. You both make reference in your submissions to the issue over the wording of the referendum question and the role of the Electoral Commission, and obviously this has been a matter of some debate in recent weeks. How, bearing in mind we have obviously the referendum bill to come before the Parliament, and the Section 30 order itself makes recognition of the Political Parties Elections and Referendum Act, which obviously covers the role of the Electoral Commission. I think it's in the interest of everybody that there is a fair and balanced question. How do you think that is achieved in terms of the legislation to come and giving due weight to the role of the Electoral Commission?
That the Electoral Commission now have a question that they will test, and they will test it on the grounds of intelligibility. And intelligibility is interpreted quite broadly, and they have set out a number of criteria in their guidelines to consider that. I have to say I don't envy them their task in this case, because we're in an unusual situation in the past when the Electoral Commission has judged a question. They've already had the substantive proposal or piece of legislation upon which that question is based. And we're in a different situation now, where the substance of the question is itself perhaps a little ambiguous. In other words, what does it mean for Scotland to be an independent country? I suspect if we asked that question around this table, we'd have some differences of opinion, not necessarily on party lines. So I think it's quite difficult to judge the intelligibility of a question when we don't necessarily have clarity on what the substance of the question is.
In terms then of the role of the you've obviously demonstrated that you see there are some difficulties for the Electoral Commission in countering in going forward with a role in terms of testing their question and taking that forward, particularly bearing in mind that the legislation is still to come before the Parliament. What do you think? What weight do you think the government should give to the role of the Electoral Commission in the job that they're doing in examining the question?
I think that the Electoral Commission sees itself as an advisor, so it will make recommendations and it will advise. There is nothing set in stone to suggest that advice should be binding on Parliament or on government, if that was the implications of the question. However, I think that it will be politically difficult to ignore the advice that comes forward from the Electoral Commission in that respect. So it has authority and it has legitimacy. I think it's really important for everyone that the referendum process is seen to be legitimate. I think that will be essential to secure what we would term in the literature loser's consent, so that those on the losing side will consent to the outcome of the result. So I think that's an obligation on all sides of the debate and the campaign to try and ensure that.
Well, you've got a question in the same area, I think.
I'm just interested in this point that you're making about not knowing what the substance is before you pose the question. I mean, would you be recommending to the Electoral Commission that they wait, or that the white paper is brought forward before the question is set? Is that something that you would think appropriate?
It's very difficult given the situation that we're in. I think that would be the ideal scenario, but we're not in that place, and there is a time bar on when the referendum could be held. And I think the debate to date has been to try and get process issues resolved, and then let's get on to the substance. My point is just that in an ideal scenario, we would have had a white paper and a substantive proposal that could potentially allow, for example, a preamble to the question, as has been the case in previous referendums, to help voters to interpret and help the Electoral Commission to judge the intelligibility of the proposal itself. Obviously, when it comes to the referendum, there will be a substantive proposal, but will it be part of the question itself? Probably not, given the order in which we're doing these things just now. So I think the ideal scenario is if you had a preamble, if you had some sort of agreement on the kind of independence that people are being asked to make a judgment on, so that voters could be clear on the consequences of a yes vote and the consequences of a no vote, as far as is possible in this case.
Is there a danger that the substance doesn't match the question when it comes to the referendum?
I think the question is inherently ambiguous anyway, just given the way that it's framed and given that whatever constitutional settlement we arrive at in the event of a yes vote, or indeed in the event of a no vote, if that was the case, then there would be an element of negotiation required. So if the Scottish Government, when the Scottish Government puts forward its white paper, which one assumes will spell out what it sees an independent Scotland looking like, that has to be then negotiated with the rest of the UK, with the UK Government, with other international actors, and it's not necessarily entirely within the gift of the Scottish Government to state exactly what the outcome would be, but at least then we could have a judgment on the public's view of that proposal. You see what I mean? So if there was a preamble that set out the proposals as in the white paper, then we have an advisory referendum which gave a view, a public view of people's sense of whether they agreed and wanted that sort of constitutional scenario.
Thanks.
Mr. Galley, and then I'll come to Linda.
Thank you. I agree with a great deal of what has just been said. In my evidence, which I appreciate you won't all have had the chance to read, I set out at paragraphs 8, 9 and 10 what I see as the different dimensions of the concept of intelligibility. There's the institutional question, which has been touched on. So that is, what exactly does intelligibility? What position does the word intelligibility put the Electoral Commission in? Now, the statute's quite clear on this. Section 104 of PROPERA is quite clear on this. The Electoral Commission should consider the wording of the referendum question and shall publish a statement of any views. Paragraphs 7 and 8 of the agreement between the two governments say this is the approach we will take. However, it's clear from press releases of the last week or so that there's actually a divergence of opinion as between the Scottish Government and the Electoral Commission as to how that wording, how intelligibility should be interpreted. The Scottish Government takes a fairly straightforward interpretation of intelligibility. That is that the question will be tested to check that it is easy to understand, to the point and unambiguous. That's more or less a dictionary definition of intelligibility. The Electoral Commission, as it has done since 2009, takes a slightly broader view. That is that we will assess the referendum question to see whether voters find it clear, simple and neutral. Now, clarity, simplicity and neutrality are laudable goals, but it's not what the statute says. And that creates a space in which there will potentially be there's a gap there between legality and legitimacy. Now, ideally you want both, but it would be well within the rights of the Scottish Government to say, well, that's just not what Section 104 says, and that's not what we've signed up to. You're not entitled to pass judgment on questions of neutrality of the question, and if you do, we're entitled to ignore it. That would not surprise me at all. Whether it would be the most legitimate approach, as Nicholas suggested, whether that's the approach that will garner the support of the nation, and therefore also those who lose, who end up as losers, is a different question, and perhaps one that shouldn't be ignored. The second aspect of intelligibility goes to this sequence, what I call a sequencing issue. So does the question come first, the consideration of it, and then the white paper, or should it be done in a different order? And it strikes me, that, and I agree entirely with what Nicholas said, that the concept of an independent country, and whether Scotland is one, is open to such manifold interpretations that and the Scottish Government is going to tell us what its interpretation of that is in, November 2013. But it seems odd that we're being asked, the Electoral Commission and those of us who've been invited to comment upon the question, are being asked to consider this question in the absence of any firm view from the Scottish Government of what that term actually means. So there's a sequencing problem there. The third issue is that in terms of the practice of the United Kingdom, of referendums in the United Kingdom, there has not always, but normally, been a relatively substantive question which refers to an official publication which establishes what's at stake. Okay, so that might have in the 79 referendums there were references to the Wales Act or to the Scotland Act of 78 for the purposes of the Good Friday Agreement. There was reference to the Good Friday Agreement in the question, and so on and so forth. So if you look at all the past questions, they've referred to a document which settles many of these substantive questions, and then citizens are enabled to answer their questions on that informed basis. And I think that's a useful precedent. The question as we have it certainly has the virtues of pithiness. I'm not sure it has... that's the only virtue to be considered.
Linda?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I'm quite interested in some of Dr McEwen's evidence, particularly interested, having had the discussion just now about the, and a sufficient explanation of what it means for Scotland to be independent, and we have talked about the white paper, which will lay that out. The next part in that sentence in the evidence says, and what it means for Scots to reject the independence option. I just wonder whether Dr McEwen and Mr Galley have views on how that information should be set out to allow people to make an informed choice.
I think in writing that, I was considering in particular the decision to have only one question with two responses, two options. And that leaves, as we know, a substantial proportion of people who had indicated and suggested that they favoured something in between those two options. And I think it will be important to that section of the electorate in particular to know what rejecting the independence option would mean for the future of devolution. I think it's important. I know that the debate and those on the pro-union side have suggested that we have to resolve the independence issue first and then have a debate about the future of devolution. My point is that I think if we want to ensure that the referendum is informed, then there should be greater clarity in advance of the referendum about the consequences of not just the yes vote, but the consequences of the no vote. And I think it would be preferable and fairer for those being asked to make the judgment if there was greater clarity this side of the referendum rather than the other.
I won't add much to that. I would, however, think that it would be slightly onerous for the Scottish Government to have to discuss at great length in its own document the consequences of the failure of its own policy. That doesn't strike me as a particularly fair thing to ask it to do. But it does raise the issue of the provision of impartial information. And in the preparer's scheme, there is some provision for the Electoral Commission to provide impartial information. You can imagine, however, that the Electoral Commission is not terribly keen on providing particularly substantive impartial information, because every comma and sentence will be argued over fiercely by one side or the other, or most likely both. So I would be very keen on hearing a robust explanation of what an independent country is, and leave it to the debate, and for the Scottish Government to present that, and leave it for the debate to explore the implications of one result or the other.
Yes. Can I clarify that? Did you say at the beginning of your response here that you thought it should be up to the Scottish Government to lay out the results of a no vote as well as
exactly the opposite.
A yes vote? So, right, well, excuse me for getting confused about what you said then. Who do you think should lay out the implications of a no vote?
Other participants in the debate.
Sorry?
Other participants in the debate.
Right. So you don't think there should be anything formal laid out? If there's a white paper talking about independence, you don't think there should be something a bit more formal laid out talking about what the consequences of a no vote would be?
I think that my primary concern is that I think it would be... This is essentially a political question for me. It's not particularly a legal question. And it strikes me as onerous to impose upon a government making a policy proposal to impose the form and substance of how that policy proposal should be presented. That's a matter for the government to do itself. And if it thinks that it's appropriate to say nothing about the no question, then so be it. But it shouldn't be compelled to lay out the implications of the failure of its own policy.
Talking about the UK?
No, the Scottish Government.
I think we should move on.
Right, okay. I shall mull.
It's not really relevant to this necessarily. Some of this discussion we're into the section 30 itself. So, but Patrick, you may be a lead on from that. Maybe a natural place if I've got the right sense of where you are. Then I'll come to Patricia.
Yeah, I was tempted to follow on from that earlier discussion, but if you'd rather we moved on, then I'll do that.
Have a bit of a follow on, but we were getting the debate going there, which wasn't really about questions. So, Patrick, you wanted to go in that area, please.
Very briefly, in that case, I can see why the case is being made that it would be preferable for both the yes and the no votes, the consequences of them to be clear. But is it not reality that the consequences would depend on the outcome of the 2015 UK election, or the 2016 Scottish election, or the resolutions of uncertainty that can't happen until there is a mandate from the people in the referendum, that those consequences actually on both sides will contain uncertainty until there is a mandate.
Yes, I agree. However, and perhaps this is a role for the academic community as much as for anyone else in the debate, but I think there can at least be greater clarity and honesty about the uncertainties surrounding the process. So yes, I agree.
You go to another area, Patrick.
Yes.
Patricia, was your question in this particular area? And do you want to just now, and I'll come back to Patrick.
Okay. Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. I think this is a very interesting element of the debate, and it's not one that we have discussed previously in our committee sessions, so it's slightly new to all of us in that sense. But I wonder, I mean, given that the Edinburgh Agreement is an agreement between the two governments, that there will be a referendum and that referendum will be on one question based on the proposition that Scotland should be an independent country. And given that the Scottish Government will publish its white paper outlining what it believes an independent Scotland should look like, and therefore its contention of the proposal for the referendum, whether, to go back to what Dr McEwen was hinting at earlier, whether what you were actually saying was that if you were asked for your advice to the Electoral Commission would be that it would be better that there was a preamble that reflected that proposal, and therefore would it be better to wait until that outline at least is available for consideration before the final question is agreed?
In an ideal world, perhaps, but there are political realities and timetabling issues, and I certainly wouldn't want to prolong the process debates if that meant that it delayed the more substantive debates. So I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend waiting and returning to these issues, but I think it's unfortunate that that's the situation that we're in.
So, to use Mr. Galley's phrase, the sequencing is not as good as it might be.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, but given that we are going to have to wait for that debate to open up when we get the white paper in all sorts of ways, you know, none of us are going to be clear about what that position actually is. Is that something that you think should actually influence what any preamble might be?
It could be possible, for example, to, in anticipation that there will be a white paper, to draft a preamble that makes reference to the white paper, even though we don't yet know what the details of that white paper will be. So that may be possible. I'm not sure what the legal position on that would be in terms of passing legislation, but it's certainly feasible, perhaps one way around it.
I'm not exactly...
Mr. Galley, so ask Annabel to ask a question, and you can wrap it up into your answer the next time around, because we need to move on to other areas if we're going to cover everything here.
I just seek a simple point of clarification, Convener, about an earlier issue where I was trying to come in on the intelligibility element. And you said, Mr. Galley, if I remember correctly, that the Deputy First Minister's definition was pretty well a dictionary definition, what she had said, whereas the Electoral Commissioner for Scotland, Mr. McCormick's version was, I think you described it as more expansive. Did you refer to a statutory definition?
No, there isn't a statutory definition. There's the statute, the section 104 of PAPERA, says the Electoral Commission shall consider the wording of the referendum question and shall publish a statement of any views of the Commission as to the intelligibility of that question. So that's where we get the word intelligibility from. We get it from the statute, but it's not further expanded or clarified in the statute. What we have is a degree of practice on the understanding of the on the interpretation of the word intelligibility. So all of the referendums post 2000, post PAPERA, so the North East referendum and the two referendums of last year, intelligibility only really arose in the Welsh referendum of last year, in which the Electoral Commission did engage, did rewrite what was a fairly unintelligible question. It's not obvious that it improved it, but it certainly engaged in the question of intelligibility. It didn't engage in intelligibility understood as neutrality. That wasn't the basis of its interpretation. It was intelligibility in the narrower sense of cognition.
Actually, I don't quite agree with that, because there have been previous occasions when, and the Welsh case was one of them, the North East another, when the Electoral Commission's report has taken issue with do you agree questions, for example, on the grounds of their perceived perceived partiality, and made recommendations to alter the wording to either should questions or that didn't quite work in the Welsh language version of that question, but it was rephrased on that basis.
Okay. Patrick, I think you're another area you wanted to concentrate on as well.
Thank you, Convener. At some point in the future, we'll get into debating a bill which, in theory, will contain specific wording and timing and so on. At the moment, we're looking at this order which is intended to give effect to an agreement between the two governments. And that agreement doesn't place very many constraints. It doesn't, for example, say there should be a yes or no question as opposed to two balanced statements. It doesn't specify the timing other than an end point at which the order would no longer have effect. But the agreement was signed in the context in which the Scottish Government had already published a draft bill, a consultation draft bill, which makes it clear that there would be a date in primary legislation, for example, and which makes it clear that there would be a ballot form included as a schedule of the legislation. Can I ask your view if the government was, for example, to include in the bill the power to set a date by secondary legislation, or didn't want to include a final ballot form but wanted to have further consultation on whether to include a preamble on the ballot form? If the government wasn't to resolve those questions in the way that it had indicated in the consultation draft that it would, where would that leave the agreement? Would there be doubt about whether the agreement was being given effect to properly?
I'm going to let Navraj take most of that question because I think it's essentially a legal question. But I don't think there's anything in the Section 30 order, or probably in the agreement, that imposes the time limits on the different stages of the process. The only time limit, as far as I can see, is the cut-off date at the end. So I don't see, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't see an impediment to necessarily doing it in that way. Navraj?
Just flicking through the agreement, it does say a little bit more about questions of timing other than the end date. It does, for example, in paragraph 27, make reference to the regulated period being 16 weeks.
Yeah.
So, so it's not completely silent on these questions. I think there are certainly practical issues arising from not including the ballot paper in the bill. The elections to this place in 2007 were characterised by rather unfortunate procedures in the run-up to the election, that election, including the availability of the ballot paper in good time in advance of the poll. So, and it was agreed in the aftermath of that, of the Gould report, by all parties that that sort of process should be avoided. So there are certainly sound prudential grounds for not going down that avenue. As to whether bumping, say, the ballot paper into secondary legislation would be in violation either to the text or the spirit of the agreement, I'm not sure that I see that on a first reading, but I'd like to reserve my position on that. Mm-hmm. I would have to. I've not thought about the question specifically, so I wouldn't want to pin myself down on that.
Well, it may be that the Cabinet Secretary in a little while's time will be able to clarify what the intention is on that. I also just wanted briefly to ask Dr McEwen about her written evidence on the issue of the now non-existent and impermissible second question. The Secretary of State, when he gave evidence, argued that there was no legitimate way of including a second question, and that was why they'd insisted on this precondition in the negotiation between the two governments, and he rejected the formulation suggested by John Curtis, in which the second question would be predicated on the outcome of the first. So the second question being, if Scotland votes no to independence, would you support some formulation of further devolution? Your written evidence, Dr McEwen, says that actually there's ambiguity in the idea of a single question, because a substantial proportion of the supporters of either option would actually have that as their second preference if they were being asked something more widely. Could you just respond to the Secretary of State's objections to that Curtis formulation, if I can call it that? And is there another way in which that second question could have been fairly framed that you would have preferred to see?
Yes. In the responses that my colleagues and I submitted to both the Scotland Office consultation and the Scottish Government's consultation, put forward an alternative to the Curtis formulation and to some of the others, which was a two-question referendum with a gateway question. And the gateway question, the first question, would be on the principle of change. And I don't think the second question would necessarily have to be, anyone could answer two questions regardless of their answer to the first, and I think both should be counted. But the second question, assuming a majority voted for change on the first, would then spell out two options for change: the Scottish Government's programme for independence and another. So in that way, I mean, those sort of gateway questions have been used in other cases, successfully in New Zealand in their referendums on electoral reform, very recently in Puerto Rico. And I think that the advantage of that in the Scottish case would have been that, assuming a majority voted for change, with only two options on the second question, one of them would have secured majority support. And so I saw it as a way to overcome some of the difficulties that Mr Rennie has pointed out with other formulations of a multi-option referendum or a two-question referendum, but a way that you could still get over 50%, a majority consent for whichever was the preferred option for change.
Thank you. Again, I'll perhaps explore that later with the Cabinet Secretary.
Billy's got a small question. I want to move on to other areas if we can.
I mean, all this stuff is partly irrelevant because it's been decided what we're going to do. But New Zealand, it should be noted, was two referenda with three questions. It wasn't simply two questions over one referenda. If you look at the New Zealand model, it was two referenda and three questions.
Well, they had different ones, of course. They had different stages of referendums. But
it was, the conclusion would have been reached after a second referendum.
Yes, but there are different ways to do that. So you could have a question on principle of change and then a question on the kind of change that you want. I mean, you can have it on the same day, you can have it on different days, and there are different ways and different practices.
That's right.
Let's move on. This is not really... just on the issue, first of all, in Patrick's first question, just for a point of clarity, having had a quick look at the memorandum of agreement between the two governments, it does set out that the wording of the question will be for the Scottish Parliament to determine and will be set out in the referendum bill. So I think it probably answers that issue about whether there be any secondary legislation issue involved. So, is there any other... I think we've time for one more question.
I kind of wanted to get back to the Edinburgh Agreement and the Section 30 order, which is kind of, I thought, what we were supposed to be scrutinising this morning. Good morning to you both. My question concerns the Edinburgh Agreement and the paragraph 30 thereof, the last sentence, which I'll read out again for the record. The two governments are committed to continue to work together constructively in the light of the outcome, whatever it is, in the best interests of the people of Scotland and of the rest of the United Kingdom. Could I ask both witnesses this morning what they take that to mean?
Excuse me.
I take it to mean very little. I think it's a statement of good faith, which one would assume between constituent parts of the same nation or two neighbours. I take very little of substance from it at all. I'm glad it's there, but I don't think I would lose a great deal if it was absent.
I largely agree, and I noted the Secretary of State was reluctant to go further than the statement in his evidence last week. It would be useful to probe that at a later stage as to what that means substantively, but I agree, I don't really see it as meaning very much more than a principle of good faith.
Okay, thank you. And presumably in this context, the principle of good faith is from a political perspective and a moral perspective, actually crucial. I understand from a legal perspective that it's perhaps not got the same weight, but looking at it in the round, I would have thought actually it's quite a pivotal statement of goodwill in the context of the process that we are now embarked upon.
I agree, provided there is a common understanding of what the referendum is about and of what it means to be an independent country, and I refer back to the earlier discussions on some of the problems and ambiguities around that.
Okay, Stuart, I think you've got time for a very one small question.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Just asked this question last week, and I thought it'd be useful to ask it again today. This Section 30 order, is it fit for this Parliament to pass, bearing in mind we can't amend it?
Yes.
Yeah, no, sorry, I'm taking the time to think about this. I don't work quite as quickly as Nicola. Well, technically, it's clear. It's there's no technical impediment, but that's not the question you're asking. I think you're asking the question of whether it's appropriate for this Parliament to fit. Is it fit? Well, it's the procedure you've got.
Is that a yes? Is that a yes? Is that a yes?
Yeah, okay, we'll take that as a yes then, in these circumstances. Thank you very much, both of you, for coming and giving evidence today. Very grateful and very helpful. So, thank you very much. I don't think we've really got much time for a break, so I think we'll just... So I think we'll just move on and let the Deputy First Minister take her place and just keep going. Do you agree? What did you say? You need to. Okay, welcome back, committee, to our last evidence session taken on the Section 30 order. I'm very warm welcome to Deputy First Minister and Government Strategy and Constitution under a brief, Nicola Sturgeon. We've also got Graham Fisher from the Legal Directorate and Stephen Sadler from the Head of the Elections team. Now, we've set around about up to 45 minutes to allow us to have a discussion on this issue before we get to, if we require that amount of time, before we get to the actual moving of the motion. But Deputy First Minister, have you got any opening statement you want to make, or do you just want to crack on with questions?
I'm happy to make a brief opening statement, Convener. Firstly, to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to be here today to answer any questions that you have. As I've said previously, I'm very pleased, and the Scottish Government is very pleased with the outcome of the negotiations that we had with the UK Government. I'd place on record at this stage my thanks and appreciation to Michael Moore. We had very constructive dialogue, which led to an agreement incorporating a draft order that, subject to the agreement of both parliaments, will now allow the Scottish Parliament to legislate for a referendum that is made in Scotland and is beyond effective legal challenge. I think the Edinburgh Agreement was a watershed moment in Scotland's Home Rule journey. It now paves the way for what I think we all accept and agree is the most important decision that we'll take in over 300 years, and it will ensure that the rules and regulations around that referendum are very much decided in this Parliament. The only issue of regret I have, and again I'm on record on this issue, is that the decision on whether there should or should not be a third option on the ballot paper was not a decision left for this Parliament to take. However, that aside, I'm nevertheless pleased that the UK Government conceded all of the other conditions that they'd originally proposed. As we set out in our consultation paper back in January, it is the Scottish Government's intention to have a referendum on independence in autumn 2014, and it will be for this Parliament now to make the final decision on how that referendum will be run and to ensure that it meets the highest international standards. Our detailed proposals will of course be set out in a bill that will be introduced early next year. These proposals will be informed by the results of our consultation. That analysis, as members will be aware, showed broad support for the Scottish Government's proposals, including the wording of the referendum question, but the committee will also be aware that I wrote last week to the Electoral Commission to ask them to begin the process of testing the intelligibility of that question. The Commission will of course publish its report in due course. The Government will fully consider that report, and then the Parliament will have the opportunity to make the final assessment of the question and of course all of the other proposals associated with running that referendum. So that's where we are, Convener, and I'm very happy to answer any questions on any of these matters or any other matter that the committee wishes to ask me about.
Okay, thank you, Deputy First Minister. There was one question which came up as a result of the evidence that we had just prior to you coming along, and that was about whether or not there should be a preamble to the question in regard to, obviously the Government's put its question to the Electoral Commission, and there was a question certainly from some of the people who were given evidence to us that perhaps that question should also have a preamble to it that makes it clearer what the Government's proposing by the way of the question. I just wondered, and I know it's a bit early to be asking you that question, what your thoughts might be about whether that might be a possible thing that could happen.
Well, I'll be interested in the views of the Electoral Commission, and obviously we'll pay very close attention to any views that the Electoral Commission express on that matter or any other aspect of the question. We haven't submitted a suggested preamble with the question. We've submitted the question that was set out in our consultation. I should say that question was broadly supported by 64% of people who responded to the consultation. Our position is very clear that we believe our obligation as a government is to set out in the white paper what we mean by Scotland becoming an independent country, and it is that process that will ensure that people who vote in the referendum understand exactly what that question means and what a yes vote for that question will result in. So our view as the government at this stage is that that preamble is not required, but we will of course pay close attention to any views the Electoral Commission put forward on that matter.
Anybody else want to go in that area? Willie?
I mean, the evidence that was given earlier indicated that it was unusual for the Electoral Commission to be asked to judge on a question when they didn't actually have the substance. That it was usually the other way around, that you knew what you were posing the question on because you had the substance in place. And it was suggested that perhaps the order should change. is would you consider bringing forward the white paper or delaying the question setting?
No, I think the order we've chosen to do things in is the right order, and it gives Parliament its proper place in the process. We've said for quite some time now that the white paper will be published round about this time next year, and that's the timeline we continue to work to. I think it's absolutely appropriate. In fact, I would go further. I think it's absolutely essential that the testing of the question is done in good time for the introduction of the referendum bill. And you will be aware, as I am, of the time requirements to put that legislation through Parliament. I want, and the Electoral Commission, I would imagine, would want the Parliament to know its views on the question before we get to the stage of considering the bill. There is an up to a 12-week process now that the Electoral Commission is engaged in. I think that's an appropriate order. I think it's an appropriate timeline to set out. But as I've said to the convener, we will pay very close attention to any comments, any observations, any suggestions that the Electoral Commission makes, because we take its role in this process very seriously indeed.
Is it the same area? Or?
Slightly broader.
James first, and I'll come back to you.
You said you'll pay close attention to what feedback you get from the Electoral Commission. Once they have tested that and have produced evidence, if they propose or suggest a different wording, will you accept that?
Well, let me be very clear about the role of the Electoral Commission, and before I do so, let me be equally clear that the role we envisage and the role we have asked the Electoral Commission to perform, both in terms of testing the question, but also the advice we've asked the Electoral Commission to give us in terms of campaign finance, is exactly the same role the Electoral Commission would have if this was a referendum being governed by the UK Parliament. And we're very clear in that the role of government is to propose, the Electoral Commission to advise, and Parliament to decide. And I think I've seen comments from Andy O'Neill, the head of the Electoral Commission in Scotland, that makes very clear that is their understanding of the role. They are not the decision makers; they are the advisers. That said, I have great respect for the authority and the expertise of the Electoral Commission. It's been built up over a number of years now. I think any government anywhere in the UK would not depart from Electoral Commission advice unless there was a very, very strong reason to do so. And any government doing so would clearly have to justify itself before Parliament. That's not a position I want to be in, it's not a position I expect to be in, but nor am I going to sit here and attempt to give away the proper role of government and the proper role of Parliament in this process, because I think it's right that that process is one we continue to respect.
Annabelle?
Directly in point with what the Cabinet Secretary has been talking about, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The whole Edinburgh Agreement is set against a backdrop of fairness and a result that everyone will respect, and standards of fairness, transparency, propriety. And I'm reassured by what you say of the Electoral Commission in the context of all of that. Professor Alan Trent said to the committee last week in evidence that the Commission, and he was talking about the Electoral Commission, falls into the category of a body that gives advice rather than provides a direction, but its advice is sufficiently authoritative that it should normally be followed, and one would expect it to be followed. And he went on to say if we got to the point where Parliament did not follow the advice, that would raise serious problems for the referendum's conduct and for the respect of the outcome. So my question, Cabinet Secretary, is if the very commendable criteria which surround the whole Edinburgh Agreement are to be seen to be satisfied, not just by government and not just by this Parliament, but by the people who are expressly referred to in the Edinburgh Agreement, isn't it the case that really the Electoral Commission's advice becomes very, very strongly persuasive to governments and parliaments?
I mean, I would refer Annabelle Goldie to the answer I gave to James Kelly, where I think I made very clear my respect for the role of the Electoral Commission in this process and the weight I think that any advice that the Electoral Commission gives any government on matters to do with elections or referendums has to be taken very seriously. But to go back to the Edinburgh Agreement, the Edinburgh Agreement clearly, in many aspects of it, is seeking to follow the process laid down in PEPERA, and around campaign finance, for example, the process that we are envisaging here is exactly, precisely identical to the process that would be followed by the UK government if it was the UK government that was legislating for this referendum. And that is very clearly a process, as I said earlier on, where governments propose, the Electoral Commission advises and parliaments decide. And it is not for me to hand away the role of Parliament to be the decision maker. But I've made very clear my views on the weight of Electoral Commission advice, and any government that is seeking to depart from Electoral Commission advice, as I should say the UK government has done over the localism bill in terms of referendums around council tax rates in England, would have to give a very clear explanation of why they were doing that and the basis on which they were doing it, and Parliament would have to come to its judgment on whether those reasons were sound or not. So, I am very clear on the importance of the Electoral Commission part of this process, but, I also think it's very important that the processes we have in this Parliament are on the same basis as the processes for any referendum that would be held if the UK government was legislating for it.
Okay. Tiny follow-up, Cabinet Secretary. I understand totally what you're saying about the role of the Parliament, but if we're all honest, the only independent presence in all of this process is not a Parliament where your own party has a majority, it is the Electoral Commission.
I think I've made very clear, I think the Electoral Commission's role is very important on this. I don't think it is for me to sit here and either give away the role of Parliament, because I don't think parliamentary democracy should be dismissed just because one party happens to have won a majority. And there have been majorities in the House of Commons down the ages, sometimes under your own party, very large majorities. I don't think anybody would have suggested that somehow invalidated the principle of parliamentary democracy. So, parliamentary democracy is very important. That would be my first point, which I've made repeatedly. Secondly, I'm not going to sit here and somehow preempt what the Electoral Commission will say. I actually, deprecate some of the comments we heard last week from leading politicians on the other side of the argument to me, who were, before the Electoral Commission even had received the question, were dismissing it as being unfair and biased. I think that shows contempt for the process. Let's have this process. Let's allow the Electoral Commission to do its job, and then let's Parliament, in the fullness of time, under tried and tested procedures that mirror the PEPERA procedures, come to its view. And I'll be happy to sit before this committee or any committee and stand up in Parliament and defend the position that the government ultimately takes, as is the government's right, on all of these matters.
Patrick, then Annabel.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. A couple of very straightforward questions. First of all, the agreement and the Section 30 order doesn't specify certain things that I might have expected it would. For example, will the date of the referendum be explicitly on the face of the bill, or are you leaving open the option to set that at a later time through secondary legislation?
No, we'd have the date on the face of the bill.
Thank you. That's very clear. And as with the consultation draft of the bill, will the bill as introduced include the ballot paper as a schedule of it?
Yes.
So any questions about a preamble, that would be subject to scrutiny through the same process?
By the time we get to the stage of introducing the bill, we will know what the Electoral Commission's conclusions are around the testing of that question, and we will have the opportunity to reflect that in the bill we introduce.
That's helpful, thank you. I also just wanted to explore the issue of the way in which the second question was debated during the
Annabel doesn't want to cover this area. Are you in a new area?
On the previous area, but Patrick's gone ahead, so I'll just come in.
Okay, well, on you go, Patrick.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, you expressed at the beginning some of your regret around the fact that the option of a second question was ruled out by the UK government, and that you weren't able to leave that as a decision that Parliament would take. We've heard some objections to the idea of various formulations of a second question from the Secretary of State last week and from others. We've also heard objections today from witnesses saying, or certainly one witness in particular, saying that a simple yes or no question leaves some people having to vote for what is in effect their second preference, and it doesn't give the clarity around people's wishes that could be achieved. Can I ask, how much discussion was able to take place in the negotiations that led to the agreement and to the terms of the Section 30 order, or was this simply an absolute precondition? We won't pass a Section 30 order, we won't have an agreement unless the Scottish Government give way on this?
Let me just say a word. I'll come on to that precise question in a minute. I mean, the whole issue of the second question, I mean, let me be very clear. As somebody who will be voting yes, I don't think I've given away any secrets there, as somebody who believes that the outcome of this referendum should be a yes vote, I'm perfectly happy with a yes or no question. That said, I always believed, as did the government, that the decision about whether it should be yes or no, or that there should be a third option on the ballot paper, was a decision that this Parliament should have taken. Now, we can speculate about what that ultimate decision would have been. We will never know that, but it should have been a decision taken by this Parliament. The UK government, and I'm not going to go into all of the different discussions that I had with Michael Moore in detail, but the UK government was very clear that was their red line. Now, we operated on a basis that nothing was agreed until everything was agreed, and we had a package, the Secretary of State and I, that we felt we could put to the Prime Minister and the First Minister respectively. But they were very clear that they would not agree to a Section 30 order unless it was on a single question. Now, we had a judgment to make. I had a judgment to make about whether the package that we were able to agree was satisfactory, and given that every other condition that, if you think back to January, the UK government was saying should be attached to this referendum. They wanted to control the timing, they wanted to control the question, they wanted to control the franchise. Given that we got concessions on all of that, my judgment was that that was a package I felt able to recommend to the First Minister for signature. I still, wish that that hadn't been their red line, but it was, and I think we're in a place now with a Section 30 order that puts the referendum beyond any effective legal challenge, and I think that is a decent and a good place for us to be as we approach the debate on the substance.
So there was no willingness on the part of the UK government then to, for example, consider the pros and cons of different formulations of a wider range of options. This wasn't a technical objection; it was a principled objection.
I'm kind of reluctant here to try to put words into Michael Moore's mouth or the mouth of anybody on the other side, but certainly my very firm understanding was that it was for the UK government a red line in principle, not just a red line over a particular wording of what a second question might look like.
Thank you.
Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. Before I go on to my substantive question, I just wanted, going back to an issue raised a wee while ago, to say how pleased I was to hear the Cabinet Secretary reaffirm that it will be the role of this Parliament to decide on the referendum bill and its contents, and that's quite right and proper. And of course, this Parliament, the composition of this Parliament was determined by the democratic vote of the people of Scotland in the May 2011 elections. And finally, on the issue of the localism bill in England, I note that the Right Honourable Eric Pickles, MP Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, in a letter to the Chairman of the Electoral Commission in London of the 18th of January 2012, did state the legal position, which of course is, and to quote, "there is no duty on government to accept the recommendations of the Electoral Commission in part or in full stop." So that's what the UK Secretary of State had said about a different referendum. But I would like to, if I may, ask the Cabinet Secretary a question about the Edinburgh Agreement, specifically paragraph 30 and the last sentence thereof, which I'll read out again for the record. "The two governments are committed to continue to work together constructively in the light of the outcome, whatever it is, in the best interests of the people of Scotland and of the rest of the United Kingdom." Could I ask the Cabinet Secretary what she takes that to mean?
I take it to mean very much what it says, and that is a recognition on both sides that we will respect the outcome of the referendum, and that regardless of our positions in the referendum campaign, regardless of the things that are said and the stances that are taken on any particular issue, which will happen in the heat of a campaign, any campaign, once the people of Scotland have made their decision, then we will respect that decision and we will work together constructively to implement that decision in a way that is in the best interests of the people of Scotland and indeed the people of the rest of the UK. And I think that's a very important democratic statement, but I also think it's the kind of statement that the people of Scotland would expect from both the Scottish Government and the UK Government. This is not a referendum that is owned by the Scottish Government or the UK Government, by the yes side or the no side. This is a referendum to allow the people of Scotland to express their democratic views about the future of their country, and we have all got a duty to accept what they say. It doesn't mean we any of us give up on long-held views of how we would want things to be, but we have a duty to accept the democratic will of the Scottish people. Thank you.
Any other questions? James?
Section 30 order is clearly important in that it confers legal powers on the Parliament to hold or to pass legislation to hold an independence referendum. Just interested in, we're obviously aware that the government has a number of work streams, I believe 16 work streams, working on the issue. And I wondered when that work commenced and what the trigger for that was.
Well, the government's had work streams for some time. I'm happy to provide the committee with the dates of when each of these work streams started. We are in the process of preparing a white paper. I think members would be probably rather surprised if the process of producing that white paper didn't involve some considerable preparation and considerable work in terms of the content of that. I should say the United Kingdom government has, by their own admission, I can't remember the exact number, but 13 or 16 or whatever work streams working on making their case for Scotland remaining within the UK. And I think it's right and proper that as we approach the biggest decision in 300 years that our country will take, that there is good quality, accurate, robust information coming from both sides as we try to persuade the people of Scotland to vote yes, or for those who take the different view to vote another way. So I think it would actually be more remarkable if that work wasn't happening.
I understand the position that you outlined, but is there not an inconsistency in that and what you explained to Parliament on the 23rd of October, where you said that you couldn't, take any legal advice on the issue of EU membership post an independence referendum until the Edinburgh Agreement was in place?
No, I don't think there is any inconsistency at all. Just a small correction. I didn't say we couldn't. I said it was our judgment that it was better to take legal advice on Scotland's membership of the European Union when we had a clear process, a clear agreed process for how independence would be achieved. And any member who's been paying any attention to this debate, and I'm sure all members of this committee have been paying close attention, will have seen from comments of the European Commission that the basis on which independence is achieved is a highly relevant factor in the issue of Scotland's continuing membership of the European Union. Now, before we had the Edinburgh Agreement, it was, and members can say this was an unlikely state of affairs. It may or may not have been, but it was certainly a possible state of affairs that we would have had the Scottish Government legislating for a referendum without a Section 30 order, that the UK Government would have decided that that was illegitimate and out with the competence of the Scottish Parliament, that there might have been a legal challenge to our right to do so. The process then would have been very messy and unclear. It may have led to the UK Government saying that they wouldn't recognise the result of that referendum. That changed with the Edinburgh Agreement, and we now have an agreed, clear, democratic process which, to go back to Annabel Ewing's point about Section 30 of the Edinburgh Agreement, makes clear that both sides will respect the outcome. Now, that means that legal advice taken post the Edinburgh Agreement on issue of continuing EU membership is much more meaningful than legal advice that would have been taken before that agreement, because now we know the precise context and basis on which independence will be achieved.
Just one final point, Convener, but if you have all these work streams which have been going on for some time, probably since, and I accept the logic in it, since post the 2011 election, then why does the issue of EU legal advice sit separately? I don't understand that. There's an inconsistency there.
I think it's fairly clear and obvious, because it is a legal issue where the Commission itself has made clear that the basis on which independence is agreed is a relevant factor. So a country declaring UDI, for example, would perhaps be in a different position than a country that has gone through a democratic process with a referendum that both sides in advance say that they respect the outcome of. That's a very different kind of scenario to planning for how we establish a welfare system in an independent Scotland, which is not as dependent on that process. It is a clear piece of work that is looking at the mechanics of the welfare system and how we ensure the transition, regardless of how we become independent, to ensure that that system works properly in an independent Scotland. And I think the distinction between these kind of issues is certainly very clear to me.
Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I pose this question to anyone else who's actually been in front of this committee. And it's regarding the Section 30 order. Obviously, we can't amend it, so there are two options. One is to pass it, the other one is to reject it. So is the Section 30 order fit for purpose for this Parliament to pass?
Yes, I believe it is, and I wouldn't be asking the committee. I believe I'm about to move the motion to ask the committee to pass it, so I wouldn't, I say this seriously, I wouldn't be sitting here as the responsible minister doing that if I didn't think it was. This is obviously the circumstances and the reasons for which this Section 30 order is being proposed are historic by their very nature. But it is a process that is set down, and it's the same process that would be used for any transfer of competence in either direction between the UK government, UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament. So in a sense, the process is not unusual, albeit the reasons that we're using this process are rather less than the norm.
Rob, I think you wanted to ask.
Please. The House of Lords Cabinet Secretary agreement on the Referendum and Independence of Scotland report says that the UK Parliament's been invited to approve the draft Section 30 order with few guarantees that the PPERA scheme governing the fairness of referendum campaigns will be made to apply in Scotland. Do you have a view about that?
I don't agree with that. I think anybody who reads the Edinburgh Agreement, it's the Section 30 order that will transfer the legal competence, but I consider the Scottish Government to be bound politically in terms of honour and morally by the Edinburgh Agreement, and it's very clear that where appropriate, the rules and certainly the spirit of PERA will govern this referendum, and I'm very clear in my view that I would want that to be the case, and that will be the case. And perhaps one of the things that gives me greatest satisfaction about the Edinburgh Agreement is that it means the regulation of this referendum will be for this democratically elected Parliament and not for the unelected House of Lords.
Just a slight addition to that, so therefore, do you think that the terms of the Edinburgh Agreement ensure that the Section 30 order will be beyond successful legal challenge?
Well, I believe that the Section 30 order puts the referendum beyond effective legal challenge. No government on any piece of primary or secondary legislation can say it is beyond challenge. Anything is challengeable in the courts, but I believe that this puts it beyond effective legal challenge, and I know that's the view of the UK government as well.
Stuart, I believe you've got a small...
Thank you. If I could just ask, again, following on from the House of Lords report, the Section 30 order, Section 30 significantly curtails the opportunity of the UK Parliament to have an effective input into the process. And there's also been a number of individual politicians, both in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, who have seemed to express a view that effectively this is a matter that should have been decided by the UK Parliament, and the Scottish Parliament has no role in this. Do you think there's any risk that even if we pass the Section 30 order today, that the UK Parliament will refuse to do so? And if that happens, what would be the consequences of such an action?
Well, firstly, some of the politicians you refer to, I guess, are the same politicians who still haven't got over the fact that this Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, exists at all, and would still like to turn the clock back to the days when that wasn't the case. So, I'm afraid these are just some of the attitudes that we have to deal with. The section, as I said in response to Stuart McMillan, the Section 30 process was not created for the purpose of allowing this Parliament to have a referendum. It was a process that was laid down in the original Scotland Act. It's been used before. I'm sure it will be used again. I hope we get to the stage after the referendum where it doesn't need to be used because this Parliament has competence over all matters. So it's a perfectly legitimate, tried and tested, robust process. But I guess my point in principle would be I disagree strongly. I don't think it's for the UK Parliament to determine the arrangements for Scotland's referendum. I think it's for Scotland's Parliament to do that, and that's what the Edinburgh Agreement ensures will happen. I hope and expect that the UK Parliament will pass the Section 30 order, as I hope this Parliament will pass the Section 30 order if... and it's probably not helpful for me to speculate on another scenario, but I guess it would be the Secretary of State that would have to explain the situation if the UK Parliament was to do anything other than pass it. But I'm not expecting or anticipating that will be the case.
That might have been a small question, a short question, but it certainly wasn't a small question in terms of what could potentially open up. If I got the sense of this right, I think we're probably ready to move on to the next stage of the agenda, which is agenda item 4 and the actual subordinate legislation itself and the debate around the order. This is a formal debate on the motion lodged by the Deputy First Minister inviting the committee to recommend approval of the draft order. And the committee agreed at its meeting on the 1st of November to limit the debate to 30 minutes. It might not take that long, but I invite the Deputy First Minister to move and speak to the motion.
I move, Convener, that the Referendum Scotland Bill Committee recommends that the Scotland Act 1998 modification of Schedule 5 Order 2013 draft be approved. I think I've already laid out the reasons why I think the committee should approve this order. It transfers power to this Parliament to determine the arrangements for Scotland's independence referendum. That's as it should be, in my view, and I hope the committee will feel able to support the order.
Anyone else to contribute? James?
Yeah, just a couple of brief comments. I want to support the motion. I think the Section 30 order is important. As we heard in evidence last week from Alan Trench, the Parliament currently doesn't have the legislative competence to run an independence referendum, and this order begins the process of conferring those powers on the Parliament. I think that is important. I think we're all agreed on all sides of the argument that it's important that there's clarity around the legality of the referendum so that when the issue is resolved, we don't want a spillover into the courts. And I think therefore this process is important in that regard. I think it's also worthwhile pointing out that the importance of the order, because the Edinburgh Agreement alone doesn't have legal standing, the order itself, confers the legal standing. I think this also begins begins to move us on to the next stage. There's been a lot of discussion around process over the summer. I think what Scottish people are looking for is they're looking for a real debate around the issues. I look forward to taking part in that debate along with colleagues around the table, and it'll be an exciting campaign ahead, and I'm sure everybody will play a full part in it.
Thanks, James. Annabelle?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I would also like to put on record I shall support the order, and I think it does represent a constructive conclusion to a process of negotiation between the two governments, which I think has been carried out in a mature and sensible way. And I think my only observation, Convener, would be that in a sense, to me, the Section 30 order is like putting fuel in the tank. But very, very important, as is clear from the evidence we've heard in this committee, is the way that the car is now driven. And I do think that the spirit of the Edinburgh Agreement remains of paramount importance in determining how matters now progress. Because if matters become so contentious and so disputatious that this whole element of fairness and respect and confidence by the people in the process is dispelled, then all the criteria here will achieve nothing. And that means whatever the outcome of the referendum, I think there will be a whiff above it. And I don't think any of us around this table want that. We are all agreed about the process. We agree the criteria in the agreement, and I think now there's a very important obligation on all to ensure that the spirit of that agreement is manifest in subsequent activity and discussions.
Willie, then Patrick.
I just commend the Deputy First Minister for the manner in which she conducted negotiations with Mike Moore. I think it was a mature way to approach it. There was quite a lot of heat in early days, but actually I think the mature way that when the Deputy First Minister took over, I'm sure her predecessor was equally effective. But I think at the centre of this is that it's the people, not the courts, that should decide this referendum. And I think the Edinburgh Agreement effectively achieves that. And I think also the framework allows the consent of everybody to be secured as well about the process. And I think giving everybody comfort that the process is effective and fair and reasonable is really important. So the Edinburgh Agreement, I think, is a big step forward, and I will be supporting the Section 30 order.
Patrick and then Linda.
Thank you. Like others, I'm happy that we're, given the range of views about the legitimacy of a referendum without a Section 30 order, I'm happy that we're not in a position of having to decide that matter as a committee, and that we do have the Section 30 order, and I'm sure that it will pass without opposition. I'm also very glad that it doesn't include preconditions, for example, on the age of the franchise or other matters. And although I think members probably know that I'll disagree with the Scottish Government on many aspects of the substance of independence, I do want to put on record that I share the Deputy First Minister's regret that there is such a clear precondition on the issue of a second question. I think it should have been left to this Parliament to make that decision, even though, like the Deputy First Minister, I wouldn't have been campaigning in favour of any other option. I do think that the option should have been available for those who wished to vote for it. Having said that, it's on the record, and I will, like others, be supporting the order.
Linda.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I think I can speak for all my colleagues in saying that we will support this order. It's historic as far as we're concerned, because it moves us forward in the way we believe our country would be best served. When I think about the discussion round at the start of the year that I think the Deputy First Minister mentioned, when there was a lot of arguments about who had the responsibility and who had the legality to move forward, I'm glad we've now reached a point where we do have the Edinburgh Agreement, which, as others have said, makes it very plain that there's mutual respect. And I hope that as we move forward through this process in our Parliament, that mutual respect will be reflected amongst all the parties, because it is a very, very big decision that we're moving towards. And I think we owe it to the people of Scotland to act with mutual respect, and happy to support.
Getting to a situation which I'm very pleased about, that obviously the committee will be suggesting that it should be a unanimous decision, that the committee supports the Section 30. I'm very pleased about that. I think some of the words used around the table, like maturity, mutual respect, responsibility, is a good sign about where we're starting this process off from, or actually beginning to end the Section 30 process. And having been involved at the beginning of that process and now near the end of it, it's been an interesting journey. And like James, I'm really looking forward to having the exciting debate for the future of Scotland as we come to it. But does the Deputy First Minister wish to make any comments in winding up?
A couple of brief comments. I would like to take the opportunity to thank my predecessor in the negotiations. In all, he is more mature than I am in more ways than one. But Bruce did a fantastic amount of work, and the agreement we reached would not have been possible without the foundation work that Bruce with Michael Moore did, so I thank him for that. I think my second point would be, as a signatory to the Edinburgh Agreement, I'm as committed to the spirit of it as I am to the letter of the order that the committee is about to approve. I think in spite of scepticism on the part of many people, we, through constructive discussion and dialogue, reached an agreement that some people would have thought we would not have been able to reach. And if we can take that spirit into the next phase of this, then I think that will serve as well. As the Minister who will be responsible for steering the referendum bill through Parliament, I take the responsibility that comes with that very seriously, and my responsibility to explain clearly to Parliament the decisions we take around that referendum bill. And I look forward to those discussions. But more than anything, and this will be the point I end on, I look forward to the substantive discussion. I believe passionately that Scotland should be an independent, equal nation, and I look forward to making that case with at least some of my colleagues around this table as we approach the referendum in 2014.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. Can I then put the question that the motion be agreed to? Thank you. That's unanimously agreed. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Deputy First Minister. Very grateful for your time this morning. Now we move on to just the last item on the agenda. The next meeting will be on Thursday the 22nd of November, when the committee will consider in private a draft report on the draft Section 30 order. Thank you very much. That ends today's proceedings.